Chairman, to some extent the opposition have put me off my stride in the sense that of what I was going to say, but there's one point that, yes, the honourable member for Wellington Central raises. No, I know, but you raise it constantly when you get up, and one of I think your chief whip raised it today, and it's an issue that I feel that I'd like to comment about because I get rather sick of hearing it all the time when it's basically so wrong. The claim is made, and has been made today, that had it not been for Labor paying off as much debt as they had during their period of office, then New Zealand would be in great difficulty today because we'd have a huge deficit. The story goes that because had Labor taken National's advice to lower taxes, then obviously the deficit today would be so much higher and we'd be in huge difficulty. Of course, that is absolute rubbish, absolute nonsense. If we think about the period that when Labor was in government, the fact is that during the period that Labor was in government, Dr. Cullen and his Labor colleagues increased tax in real terms, and I emphasise real terms, by $5,500 per person, or $21,000 for a family of four. In other words, what Labor did was what Labor had was an alternative. They could increase taxation, or expenditure I should say, in real terms by $5,500 per person, $21,000 for a family of four, or they could have lowered taxes. Now, had Labor during that period lowered taxes but refrained from increasing government expenditure, a lot of wasteful expenditure, then the deficit position would have been precisely the same, but people would have had another $200 or $300 in their pocket. How much better off today would New Zealanders have been had Labor not wasted so much government expenditure during that period? So it's an absolute nonsense, this idea that Labor is promoting, that they were prudent and that they paid off debt. They had an alternative. They could have paid off debt and still had major tax reductions provided they did not have the wasteful expenditure that they did, equivalent to $5,000 or $100 per week per person. Mr. Speaker, the issue that I wanted to raise with the Minister of Finance is in many ways an academic one nevertheless that I feel is quite important, because in many ways it goes to the heart of New Zealand's difficulty, and that is the nature of the fiscal deficit that we have. Mr. Speaker, today and yesterday I did a little bit of work on trying to reconcile the difference between the core Crown operating balance and the net cash flows or the borrowing that the government's making of $13 billion. And I don't think there is a table that enables you to do that, and it is incredibly difficult. You've got a core Crown operating balance deficit of about $9 billion. You adjust that for Crown Enterprises operating balances. Then you get one figure, and from that you have to deduct, of course, the non-financial instruments such as depreciation, etc. And then you add to this the cash flows from investment activities, which amount to about $11.3 billion. But that's when I got into difficulty, because I could simply not find any table that demonstrated or showed me Mr. Speaker?
Honourable Sir Roger Douglas.
Mr. Speaker, that showed me how the net purchases of physical assets, which are $7.8 billion, was actually made up. I could find the capital expenditure in the departments of about 4.2, but I was unable to find the rest. Now, they may be there somewhere, but they're certainly not in a convenient table, and I'd be interested to know what the Minister intends to do about that. But the point I really want to raise, Mr. Speaker, is, and why I was interested in this, I really wanted to do a little bit of work and to analyse that so-called capital expenditure to see whether or not it is really capital expenditure, or whether in fact, in other words, if it's not real capital expenditure, then obviously the deficit is greater than the government is saying it is. And when I look at some of that capital expenditure, or so-called capital expenditure, one starts to wonder as to whether or not it should be classified as capital. Items like the National Library of New Zealand Heritage Collection. Now, it may be a worthy expenditure, but is it really capital, or should it be added to the deficit? Ministry of Education, Quality Reinvestment Program, whatever that is. Ministry of Economic Development, investing in its Accounting Standard Review Board, external reporting. Now, these might be important items of expenditure, but I raise the issue, are they genuine capital? Or, for example, the issue of the money which we're investing in Kiwi Rail, $300 or $400 million. Is this really a capital item of expenditure when it's not going to add $1 to the capital value of the railways? How can these items and many others be regarded as capital expenditure when the government is actually borrowing this money? It is not going to ever show a return. In fact, it's not the intention that it should earn an income. And I think there is a real issue here as to whether or not some items of capital expenditure that the government incurs is really capital expenditure, or it should be classified more as ordinary expenditure and therefore show above the line rather than below the line. And it's an issue. It may be a theoretical issue, but I think it's an important issue because it seems to me that the way the government arrives at its fiscal deficit in this country is somewhat different to the way in which other governments arrive at theirs. And I'm fairly certain that if we did our accounting on the same basis as other countries did, then our deficit might be substantially higher than it is claimed to be. You're on your way, Dave.